interesting chapter for me to read through. But before we do that, I think the chapter is kind of broken up into two halves. And one half is really focused on the micro, one half is really focused on the macro. So let's review micro and macro real quick. So we're going to remember that micro is focused on those individual level interactions, while macro is the big picture view. Functionalism and conflict theory are your macro level perspectives. And symbolic interactionism is that micro level perspective. What I want you to remember about symbolic interactionism, more than just being a micro level perspective, is that it is very concerned with emotion and identity. And I didn't put identity in the PowerPoint, but remember that emotion and identity, how we think of ourselves. And conflict theory and functionalism are generally not that concerned with individual level emotions. It's a bit of just a colder, matter of fact, bird's eye view of things. So the two halves of this chapter, we got the micro half and the macro half, and they kind of go back and forth within the chapter. But I'm going to try to group it in micro and macro in our little discussion here. So we'll start with status and role. We're going to start with the micro stuff. So status and role, these are definitely micro level concepts. So status is a position that you occupy. That's kind of what you are. While a role is a set of expectations and based on a particular status. It's what you do. So I want to try to differentiate between status and role because they're really similar, right? A role is a set of expected behaviors based on whatever status you were occupying, right? So I think of status as it's a thing that you are, and a role is sort of a thing that you do, or really more to the point, it's a thing you are expected to do. Status symbol, and I think the book did a good job of this, explaining how when we hear the word status symbol, we've probably heard that a lot, and we kind of think of it in popular culture as a sort of symbol of, or something that represents opulence or affluence or wealth, represents that status of you being sort of upper class. And that's true. Those are, for sociologists, those are status symbols as well. But a status symbol is anything that indicates that status, that position that you are occupying, or one of those statuses. So if you are a student, there anything that you're carrying, whether it's a book bag or a parking sticker, a parking pass, those are status symbols. Those are symbols that indicate that you hold a particular status, that of student. So put a pin in that. We've also got status sets, and these are groups of statuses that one person occupies. So now we'll ask a question that's going to pop up in Edpuzzle for you to name all the statuses, name some of the statuses that you associate with yourself. So for me, I would say that I am an instructor, I am a son, I am a brother, I am a Hornets fan, I am a North Carolina resident. These are sort of statuses that I occupy. And for each one of those statuses, I could probably think of some sort of symbol that indicates that I hold that status. So I got a parking pass on my car that says faculty on it, so I can park in the faculty lot. Well, I can park here. I wear slacks and a collared shirt and a sweater when it's cool out. But I have a certain way that I dress that sort of indicates that I have a sort of status as maybe something of a professional, if not instructor per se. So those are sort of some of the status symbols, some of the statuses I occupy and the symbols that go along with it. So I'll ask you now in Edpuzzle to name some of the statuses in your status set, maybe some of the symbols that go along with it. Now, a role set is similar. This isn't really in the book, but it makes sense, right? We have a set of statuses within a person. We also have a set of roles that go along with one particular status. And that's important to think about when we think about the difference between role strain and role conflict. Before we get into that, let's look at this little chart that shows the idea of one person, one woman who is a flight attendant, a mother, and a wife. And that's sort of a small status set for her. But within each of those statuses, there are different roles attached, different sets of expectations that sometimes can maybe come into some sort of incongruity, right? They might not mesh well. Sometimes there will be some nice overlap, like probably as a mother, emotional support provider, and medical caregiver. That makes sense. There's probably a lot of congruity between those two roles or expected set of behaviors within that status of mother. But there are times when these sets of expectations, these roles, aren't so congruous. They're incongruous. And that can result in conflict or strain. And the big difference between role conflict and role strain is role conflict involves two or more statuses, whereas role strain is occurring within a single status. So we've got examples there for you to kind of look over, but also want to go back to our picture here. So role conflict involves two or more statuses. So a role conflict would be between, if a person has to have roles that come in conflict between being a wife and being a mother, or between being a mother and being a flight attendant. That one might make more sense. Whether to go to work if your child is sick or whether to stay home. That becomes a bit of a role conflict there because your two statuses are sort of colliding and are having a little bit of conflict with each other. So a role strain, if you remember, involves a single status. So that would be if somehow in a single role or a single status of being a flight attendant, within that status, being an in-flight safety expert and being an in-flight server might come into a bit of a crunch, maybe a time crunch. Like you don't have time to be the safety expert and the in-flight server in that particular moment, and you might have to choose which one you are, which role you're going to let take over in that particular situation. There are other situations, there are other examples, we've got examples here, but just the key idea is role strain is competing roles within one status, and then role conflict is different statuses competing generally for sort of a prioritization of time. Here's another example I'll let you look over. Makes some sense. Now, sometimes when you have role conflict and you have competing statuses, the one that is going to sort of win out is the one that is closer to your identity, right? The one that where you gain more of the idea of yourself. So if you identify more as a student than you do a granddaughter, then completing your homework might take precedence over visiting your grandmother. That's a tough spot to be in. Hopefully you can find a way to do both. But that's the idea, right? One of these things becomes what we would call a master status, or might become what we call a master status, right? So not all statuses are equally important. The ones that are closest to your individual identity, to how you think of yourself, we would call those master statuses. And those can be different for everybody, right? For some of us, student might be closer to a master status. And some folks do school is maybe they're going to school part-time, and they don't get most of their identity from that idea of being a student. So not all of these examples of master statuses are going to be master statuses for everybody, right? That holds those statuses. So master status is real nuanced, right? It can be different for everybody. Now, the first two that we talked about here, ascribed and achieved, those are less nuanced. I mean, there's still a little nuance to them, but they're a little more simple, a little more cut and dry. Ascribed is just anything that you were kind of born into and voluntarily acquired, right? It's your gender, your race, family status. You're generally born into a particular social class. And so that's sort of an ascribed status that maybe you can change. Hopefully you can change. Well, just bear with me on that. Achieved statuses are things that you acquire over time, a result of your own efforts or actions. So your job, your educational status, if you're a high school graduate, that status, college graduate, that status is something that you sort of work on over time and you achieve. And it's not necessarily accomplishments, right? It's also just something that you come to over time. So your political affiliation is an achieved status because you're not born into that with that political affiliation. hopefully you've thought about it and you've sort of come to a conclusion over a period of time. So achieved status is just something that you come into over time, and ascribed status is something that you're born with. Master status is a status that gives you a huge source of your own identity. Now, next we're going to get into this real cool section on dramaturgy and impression management. Now, this comes from Erving Goffman. And Erving Goffman, what's really cool about Erving Goffman, he wrote this book, Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, where he lays out the dramaturgical analogy or metaphor for stage acting and performing social interaction. We're thinking of social interaction as a performance, right? That's the idea. And it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to think of the social interaction in this way. And it was kind of a nice breath of fresh air for sociology, which prior to that point, again, remember that sociology was born out of the horrible conditions in the cities during the Industrial Revolution. Sociology was born out of a need to study human interaction because of the problems that were going on within society. So sociology had become a really just dour, pessimistic, sort of an ugly, sad place to go, right? And then Erving Goffman comes in with this idea of social psychology, of blending sociology with psychology and viewing individual interaction in a very objective, almost cynical way. And it's a little bit fun. And for sociology, that's kind of a nice change of pace. We can have a little bit of fun with the way we go about our science. So everybody likes Erving Goffman a lot, or most people like Erving Goffman a lot. I like Erving Goffman a lot. So let's talk a little bit more about this dramaturgical analogy. It is the root word, of course, is drama, right? So we're talking about stage acting. So it's a metaphor for social interaction that everybody's putting on some sort of performance. And our performance, the performance that we play, is based on our statuses, right? And the roles. Remember, roles are a set of expectations based on a particular status. So we know what is expected of us, what we are expected to do depending on our given status. And we try to maintain that impression, right? That's the idea of impression management. This depends on our definition of the situation and who we define as the audience. So that brings us to the idea of backstage and front stage performance, where defining the audience is super key. So the example that I'll bring up for that is maybe sitting in a classroom, in a traditional classroom where there's a professor at the front of the class, and maybe you're a student and you're sitting in the class. And as it happens sometimes, you should do the reading before class, but sometimes, you run out of time, things happen. Hopefully it doesn't happen often, but every once in a while you go to class unprepared. But you want to get through that class while maintaining the impression of a good, dutiful student to the professor, who is in that case your audience, right? So when the professor is asking questions and nobody is answering, you might kind of play the performance, not of being clueless, but of being the dutiful student. You might kind of slink down in your chair a little bit or huddle over your notebook and be scribbling notes furiously to keep on this image of the dutiful student. You're paying attention, you're thinking, you're writing, you're doing. You don't want to be called on, and then you're called on anyway. And you don't know the answer because you didn't get to do the reading, but you still want to try to pass yourself. You want to save face. And Erving Goffman loves this idea of saving face. You do something, you say what you can, you base it on what you know. You do what you can to try to save face in that situation to make it not be completely embarrassing and to try to maintain some impression of being a knowledgeable, dutiful student to your audience, the professor. Now, that's where the idea, I skipped around a little bit. The front stage is that idealized performance. So you're trying to perform as an ideal student, right? The idea of yourself, you want to present to a particular audience. So your audience, in that case, is the professor. You're trying to maintain that image, that performance, that role of the ideal student, of the good, dutiful student. Now, you get away from class, and you might get into a backstage setting where you're just around your friends, where you would feel free to express the feelings that you had there. You were nervous, you were embarrassed, you did not get that reading done, and you did not know the answer to that question, and you felt out of place, and it was awful. And you could express those emotions in that backstage arena when your audience, the professor, is not around. Now, you could certainly flip that situation a little bit, and there are ways that you could behave in front of that group of friends. That would be where the group of friends is the audience, and then it becomes a front stage performance in front of the friends. And that happens a lot in, I think, I teach in high school classrooms, and I think that happens a lot in high school classrooms, that I have students who say and do things and make complaints, and they're not necessarily performing for me. Their audience in that situation is the rest of the class, their other classmates, and they're trying to put on a particular show, and I'm using air quotes for the show, but their intended audience isn't me. What they're doing for benefit of their classmates. They're trying to maintain an impression, right? Manage the impression that their classmates have of them, because they care more about that impression than they do about the impression I have of them. So that's just an example of the sort of way this thing can be used personally, right? You can make personal use of these ideas, and in some ways sort of make yourself feel better. I don't know. That's what it does me. It does make me feel better if I have a student who's kind of acting out or being very boisterous in class. I know that it's not necessarily directed at me. It's a show they're putting on for the rest of their class, and I just understand that, and it helps me operate a little bit. Now, to go a little deeper on this, because it's something that I just enjoy, there are 4 strategies of impression management and this is adapted from Goffman. It doesn't come directly from his work, but and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. There are other strategies, and there's other things that you can think of, but this is kind of a good way of operationalizing the idea of impression management. You can look at it in terms of self-promotion, where people point out their own abilities or accomplishments. Their self-promotion, I think it's kind of an intuitive thing, but you want to be seen as competent, right? You want people to appreciate your capabilities and your competence and treat you with that kind of respect. So you promote yourself. Ingratiation is where you're trying to be likable. You want people to attribute you or to think of you as someone that they get along with. So you might do favors for people, or use flattery or compliment people. You just want to be seen as someone that people get along with, and that's the process of ingratiating yourself to a group of people. This is especially important when you're going into a new place, or especially like a new job or new school or classroom. You want to be likable. Intimidation is where you signal your power to punish or some sort of control. You want to be seen as dangerous, or you want to be seen as having the potential or the ability to inflict some sort of harm, whether it's emotional harm, physical harm, professional harm. So a lot of teachers use the intimidation strategy where, they threaten your grade, or they threaten you with suspension or whatever it may be, some sort of punishment. And so they're playing up their role of authority. So there's intimidation. And supplication is where you advertise a certain weakness or shortcoming in order to be thought of as needy, or to maybe just lower expectations on yourself. And that's actually a really effective strategy that people do without knowing they're doing it all the time, is they try to just lower the expectations on themselves so they can't disappoint, right? It's an old adage, right? Low expectations is the key to never being disappointed. So if you lower the expectations on yourself, there's less of a chance you're going to disappoint somebody. And it's also a way to maybe getting out of doing a particular work, right? They say, if you hate doing a job, don't do it well, or because if you do it well, people will ask you to do it again. So the idea that you would kind of intentionally not do a job well, so that you won't be asked to do it again, is an example of supplication. And I've got a video that is going to give us some fun examples of this that we see in movies. So I hope you enjoy that. Here it comes.
Morning, Jack. Morning, Jack.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Hobbs.
Sarah.
Good morning, Sarah. It's a nice purple dress. Very purpley.
Francisco.
Francisco, that's fun to say.
Hi. Do you remember me?
I'm trying to recognize
I
you.
know, I'm in work clothes.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks.
Deb, you have such a pretty face. You should be on a Christmas card.
You just made my day.
Back in '82, I used to be able to throw a pigskin 4 miles. Are you serious? I'm dead serious. Watch this.
What the heck are you doing?
That's what I'm talking about. There you go. How much you want to make a bet I can throw a football over the mountains? Yeah. Coach would have put me in fourth quarter. We'd have been state champions, no doubt. No doubt in my mind. You better believe things would have been different. I'd have gone pro. In a heartbeat. I'd be making millions of dollars and living in a big old mansion somewhere. You know, soaking it up. A hot tub, my soul. That's enough. He's ready to fall. Run as fast as you can. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man. You're a monster. I'm not the monster here. You are. You and the rest of that fairy tale trash poisoning my perfect world. Now tell me, where are the others? Eat me! I've tried to be fair to you creatures. Now my patience has reached its end. Tell me, or I'll... No, not the buttons! Not my gumdrop buttons! All right then, who's hiding them? Okay, I'll tell you.
Courts is the right-hander. Will over the lefty.
Gary?
Yeah. Oh,
Here.
come on. Really?
You got 3 lemons.
What my baby wants, my baby gets. You know that.
No, but I wanted 12. Baby wanted 12.
Why would you want 12 lemons?
Because I'm making a 12-lemon centerpiece.
So no one's actually even eating them? They're show lemons?
Yeah, they're just show lemons. Shown in the center of the table. Glad you find that amusing, but I cannot fill a vase with only 3 lemons.
Well, can't you just use, like, maybe a drinking glass?
I could use a
Well, you
drinking...
can have a smaller version of a centerpiece.
I'm not going to use a drinking glass for our centerpiece.
You know what? I got an idea. Why don't we go ahead and scratch the centerpiece idea altogether? Because the chicken that burnt my mouth could maybe use a little bit of lemon on top of it. Guess what? Now we made a better meal versus something visually nice to look at.
What's happening here? What are you doing? What are you doing?
I had such a long day on the bus. I need a little bit of downtime. My feet are killing me.
Come on, my feet are killing me too. I worked all day. Went to the market. I cleaned this entire condo, and then I've been cooking for the last 3 hours. Come on, help set the table.
Sweetheart, you've done such a great job already. Why don't you want to finish it yourself and have that personal power, that accomplishment?
Set the table.
Right, so that was obviously kind of a humorous and exaggerated look at all 4 of those strategies, but I thought it would be kind of fun in a way to sort of see impression management in action. There's all sorts of ways that people will manage their impressions and all sorts of identities that people try to communicate and impressions that people try to maintain in front of other people. But that gives you an example of just a few of them. So now we're going to move away from the micro and we're going to delve right into the macro. And I thought about breaking up the video into 2 parts here, but this second part is going to take not as long. So I think we're just going to go right through and keep it in the same video. So remember that we're switching over to the macro perspective. So we're going from symbolic interactionism to functionalism and conflict theory. Now, institutions, the definition of institutions you're going to find really comes from a functionalist perspective, because the idea is that social institutions are these things that exist to help a society meet its basic needs. So remember that the functionalism is where we have this organismic analogy that every part of society has a specific function to serve, and that on the whole, society kind of works like an organism, and every part helps the healthy functioning of the whole. So for the functionalist perspective, institutions are vital in this process. Now we have 5 basic institutions. You can think of them as GREEF, G-R-E-E-F, government, religion, economy, education, and family. That's not an exhaustive list. There's lots of other institutions, but those are the basic 5 that we're going to go back to again and again. Now, social institutions are related to social structures. Remember, we talked about social structures as these patterns of interaction that have become ingrained over time. Now, the institutions are how these social structures are maintained from generation to generation. So if social structures are the ingrained patterns, institutions are how those patterns are maintained. So think of the idea of statuses and roles. We just had that idea, right? So a status is a position you occupy, and roles are a set of expected behaviors based on that particular status. Institutions are the way those rules are communicated from one generation to the next generation. And institutions ensure that those rules that accompany each status persist beyond this generation we currently are in, right? So for conflict theory, that idea is a problem, because remember that from the conflict theory perspective, there are problems in the structure. There is exploitation embedded in the structure of society. So that means that in these institutions, by extending these rules of behavior and these expectations that are placed on people, by extending these expectations beyond this one generation, they are also extending the problems embedded in those expectations and in the structures. But from a functionalist perspective, perpetuating these roles and these statuses and these rules and these expectations of behavior is absolutely vital and necessary. So I've got one more video on institutions, and then we'll wrap up with our discussion of societal development.
Institutions are essential parts of any society. Think about it. Police stations, schools, hospitals, businesses like Walmart and Trader Joe's are all core parts of a community. In a sense, they impose structure on how individuals behave. For example, if all the laws that exist in our community disappeared, would I still have a normal day? Probably not. People would be speeding down the street, looting my neighborhood coffee shop, and perhaps a stranger would be sleeping on my living room couch. All the things that I'm used to would be completely disrupted. Maybe a more reasonable example is, let's say all the schools had a new rule of no classes on Fridays. Then parents would have to figure out childcare for that day. Institutions and their rules definitively guide what we do. You may be thinking that you don't have a kid, and maybe you don't need childcare services. But in general, individuals are reliant on the institutions in their community. But is the reverse true? Do institutions need individuals? In general, they need lots of folks to contribute to allow them to function, but they don't typically need any one random individual. So there's a bit of an imbalance between institutions and individuals, if that makes sense. While they need individuals and are created by groups of individuals, they will continue even after the individual is gone. The concept of institutions may seem like a daunting idea, but try thinking of them as just a form fulfilling a need. Institutions meet the needs of society by filling expected roles and behaviors. For example, in order for a society to continue, it needs people year after year after year. The family institution makes sure that there will be people to carry on the next generation. We know society needs a way to keep people healthy, so you have the medical institution. And society even needs a way to encourage innovation and progress, so you have universities. There are two views of institutions, a conservative view and a progressive view. The conservative view sees institutions as being natural, positive byproducts of human nature. For example, the institution of hospitals forms naturally from the activities of humans and naturally benefits them. The progressive view takes the standpoint that institutions are artificial creations that need to be redesigned if they are to be helpful to humanity. So perhaps you can see businesses as potentially harming society if they aren't reined in. Now, unfortunately, institution is one of those words that has a very different meaning to a sociologist than it does to the average person. We average people might think of just a business or corporation when we hear the word institution. A sociologist, on the other hand, thinks of social structures when they hear the word institution. They think of governments, families, hospitals, schools, the legal system, religion, as well as businesses. Each of those parts of society continues on without regard to any individual. Governments continue even after the people within them turn over. Families continue from one generation to the next. Laws continue on after the people who wrote them are long dead and buried. Hospitals, schools, businesses, all continue past the time span of any individual and are not dependent on any one individual either.
And one more bit about institutions. These are the basic needs. We talk about social institutions as something that helps meet our basic needs. And again, this is more of a functionalist perspective, whereas the video called it a sort of the conservative versus progressive perspective. That's not perfect. I'd rather think of it as a conflict theory versus functionalist perspective. That way, you don't feel like you need to take a side, because you don't. It can kind of, there can be some truth to both. But this is just an example of the different institutions that we have and the different sort of societal needs that it's helping us meet. And it helps us meet those needs from generation to generation, right? I think that's what I liked about that video, is that it gets the point across that institutions help us extend our social norms and our social structures from generation to generation. So, the institution of government and the institution of democracy is bigger than one generation or one presidency or one span of Congress. The institution of education is bigger than one person's path to a bachelor's degree. So I think this chart is helpful. I think it's helpful. It helps me anyway. And the last thing we're going to talk about is these different types of society, or this idea of societal development. And I've got a little bit of an issue with that idea of development, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. First, let's get the ideas out there. Now, the book sort of traces our societal development from hunting and gathering to where we are now with post-industrial, or at least where we are in the United States and then Europe and Canada and Japan, the global north, as we would generally kind of think of it. We're in that post-industrial era, but the entire world wouldn't be considered to be a part of this post-industrial world. We'll touch on that in a second. The book talked about growing inequality as you move from phase to phase, as you move from hunting and gathering up to post-industrial. Each phase, the inequality rises a little bit, and that's worth noting, so keep that in mind. But I also want us to think about it in terms of specialization of labor, because that's a very Durkheimian idea. If you remember Emil Durkheim from the first chapter, one of the founding fathers of sociology, he had a lot to say about this idea of specialization of labor. How in hunting and gathering societies there was almost no specialization of labor. That means everybody did everything, right? Everybody hunted or gathered. Everybody made their own clothes, made their own food, built their own shelter. there was no, trading or bartering. Everybody kind of did everything, and they sustained their own livelihoods that way. Versus where we are now, which is where everybody kind of does one thing. Labor is super duper specialized, right? I don't cut my own hair. I don't fix my own car. I don't grow my own food or very much of my own food. I work, I make money, and then I use that money to buy the goods and services I need. But the labor that is involved to create those goods and services that I need or that I want was not my labor, right? Generally speaking. So there are phases of this, and we'll get more into this when we get into our chapter on the global stratification or globalization. But one of the big keys in this was in the agricultural era, and then moving into the industrial era when we got standardized currency and the nation state, or what we think of today as countries. Standardized currency is huge. It was just a linchpin for modern society that everybody is using the same kind of money. So you could work and you could make a paycheck. That's where you get this idea of a paycheck. Instead of being paid in food or working for your own food or for your own supplies or growing your own food so that you could trade it for other kind of goods that you needed. That's that trade and barter system. We moved away from that and more to this idea of standardized currency where you just make money and then you use that money to trade it in for whatever else you need. And then that's where specialization of labor was really able to take off, where everybody's doing different jobs and you're just making money and spending money. But one of the key things also with that's a hallmark of post-industrial societies is the idea of mass consumption, globalization and mass consumption. And that is where the issue kind of comes in. So what I don't want us to think about, I don't want us to think of development as this inevitability, right? That everybody in the world is moving towards post-industrial societies, just moving at different paces. It's not linear like that. We're all over the place. So it's an ethnocentric view, or specifically a Eurocentric view, or a sort of North American / Eurocentric view. Again, it's the idea of the global North. We're talking about Europe. We're talking about the United States and Canada. We're talking about Japan. Those types of countries that are very much post-industrial, whereas most countries in the Southern Hemisphere may not quite be at that same level of post-industrialization. And I don't want to say they're not at that point yet, because they're not necessarily moving towards that. It depends on the culture of the communities and the town and the villages. It just all depends on a lot of different things. But we don't want to take it as self-evident that everybody is eventually going to look like the United States. We don't necessarily even want that, right? If everybody, and that has to do with this idea of mass consumption, right? If everybody in the world consumed services, consumed goods, consumed resources at the same rate that the United States and Europe does, then we would have some big issues population-wise in a hurry. So we don't necessarily want the entire world to move towards this post-industrial society. And in fact, the United States and Europe with sustainability efforts may be looking to move towards something even beyond post-industrial. That's long view, though. That's super philosophical, and it gets us into an area that I'm not really fully going to go into because I don't want to prognosticate. I don't want to predict the future. But what I want to make sure we understand, like, this is an important model, right? This is an important model to understand how societies have moved and developed. And it's a real thing. Societies certainly have developed in these different phases. I just don't want us to think that post-industrial society is an inevitability for everybody in the world. It's not. It's just not necessarily true, and it can be a very ethnocentric or Eurocentric view of the world. The thing that everybody is eventually